My name again is Aman Sharma. I'm the president of the Federalist Society here in Moritz. I want to welcome you all here. This is an event co-hosted by the Federalist Society and the American Constitutional Society. And I want to thank Ashley for her help in making this happen. This event is titled Racism in Law Schools, and our format for today is a bit different than what we normally have. In terms of debates, we usually have that 12-10 format. Well, for today, our format, at the request of both speakers, is going to be a little bit different. So it'll be 6 minutes as an intro for each speaker, then 5, 5, 5 to conclude it off. So it's a bit more the back and forth. I'll start with the introductions. Professor Subotnik will go first, so I'll give the introduction for Stephen Menendian. Stephen Menendian is the Senior Legal Research Associate at Kirwan Institute here at the Study for Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University. Stephen directs and supervises the Institute's legal advocacy, analysis, and research, and he manages many of the Institute's more important projects. His principal areas of advocacy and scholarship include education, civil rights, human rights, con law, and the racialization of opportunity structures, talking about race, systems thinking, and implicit bias. He's a graduate right here of the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. His recent scholarly publications include Parents Involved, The Mantle of Brown, The Shadow of Plessy, the University of Louisville Law Review, and the forthcoming Remaking Law, Moving Beyond Enlightenment Jurisprudence with St. Louis University's Law Review. Professor Dan Subotnik is both a CPA and a licensed attorney. He worked in the investment banking field before undertaking teaching positions in law and business at variously Northwestern University, University of Illinois, Chicago, Santa Clara University School of Law, Seton Hall University School of Law, and the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. Professor Subotnik has written on a wide range of legal and non-legal topics, including taxation, accounting, torts, gender and race relations, academic research, and the regulation of sexuality. His book from 2005, Toxic Diversity, Race, Gender, and the Law Talk in America, offers a critical view of race and gender issues for the legal profession, and it's what inspired us to go ahead and get this debate started. So with that, please join me in welcoming first Professor Subotnik.
Thank you, Aman, and thank the American Constitutional Society and all the rest of you for coming. It doesn't happen very often that we get a frank discussion on race. Just to give you a sense of why I'm saying that, I wrote this book in 2005. I got terrific reviews from academics. I got reviewed in the Wall Street Journal favorably, and there was only one, and the topic of this book is race and gender in the legal academy. In the legal academy. I got one review in the law review literature, and that was by a student of mine at Touro. Otherwise, this book was entirely ignored by the very people who should have been dealing with it. My conclusion after having written this book is that discourse on race and gender is specious, manipulative, and it should be approached with skepticism and cynicism. And let me now start in earnest about the topic today. Many believe, probably some here in the room, that racism still infects the law school. And what you have in your handouts is some evidence to that effect. There is a quote from Richard Delgado, who was trying to explain why it is that African American students perform far less well than Caucasian students in law school. And what he says it is, and this is in item 7, racism in the law schools and the legal curriculum and sheer economic hardship are equally plausible hypotheses. And so my question to you, I'm not going to be able to answer the question obviously in this short time, is it true? Is there racism in our law schools, and is it having the impact that Delgado claims? What is the precise source of the problem according to Delgado? If you look at item 9, racism is reflected in Anglocentric courses and Socratic teaching methods. Why it is that African American students are not able to handle Socratic teaching methods is a question that I have no answer to. As far as Anglo-centric courses are concerned, this is an Anglo-centric country, and students have to be able to deal with things like antitrust, telecommunications law. Professor Delgado apparently wants more courses in critical race theory. But in order to be competitive, students have to learn the basics and be able to compete in those areas in which there are jobs. It's hard to imagine that law students will be better positioned for jobs with a less Anglo-centric curriculum. Professor Fagan, whose words are reproduced on the other side of the page, talks about the enormous pain of minority students, and in particular black students, on campus who have to do all that much more emotional work than Caucasian students. I go around the country speaking. This is maybe my 30th presentation. Most of the time I lecture, and I ask the question of students and faculty, where is the racism? If there is racism, if it's having this impact, where is it? And I don't get very good answers. In fact, I get very, very few answers. The only thing I hear is, well, racism infects the whole culture, and if it affects the whole culture, it has to affect the law school as well. And then I come back and I say, well, can we please have a discussion of where it is? Even if it infects the whole culture and therefore infects the law school, and we get nowhere. And so I keep going, and I say to myself, what else might be the evidence of racism if the students aren't going to tell me? And then every once in a while, some student says, well, I can't talk about the founding fathers, and I can't talk about how they were slaveholders. Everybody else wants to venerate the founding fathers, and I can't venerate the founding fathers. And I say, why not? I don't venerate the founding fathers for their roles on slavery and anything else. This is what you are here in law school for, and the conversation fizzles out. So I suggest to you that this discussion, and I'll try to prove it later on if I get a chance, the discussion about racism in law schools is destructive. That's an old theme. But I want to say it's also distracting because it doesn't get at the real problems. And so perhaps that's a little more novel. Another argument that is made has to do with the LSAT. And the idea is that the LSAT disfavors minority students, and particularly African American students. It's overused, and therefore that's evidence of racism in law school. I'll have to come back to that a little later on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the American Constitutional Society and the Federalist Society for inviting me here to discuss this important issue. The issue isn't whether whites in law school should feel responsible for racial disparities or other racially distinct outcomes in law school, but whether the institution of the law school and the broader system of legal education is exclusionary in the sense that it disadvantages students of color, and whether a dialogue is necessary to raise awareness of this fact, the specific mechanisms by which they generate these outcomes, in order that we all might work together to address them. My argument asserts that the answer to both questions is unequivocally affirmative. In particular, my argument highlights a few critical structural forces that interact with the institutional features of the law school to disadvantage students of color. The law school is an overwhelmingly white institution. As the nation population trends towards 50% minority, according to the ABA, almost 80% of law students are white. Although blacks make up 13% of the U.S. population, they account for only 6.8% of law students. Latino enrollment in 2009 to 2010 was 6.7%, and Asian American enrollment about 7.8%. But law schools are not just overwhelmingly white, they are actually getting whiter. The Columbia University study of law school matriculants in 2008, in the fall of 2008, revealed that 7.3% were African American. 15 years earlier, 7.9% were African American. This decline actually understates the problem because it occurred despite first expanding capacity due to new law school openings and accreditation, and a 23% increase in the number of black students applying. So what explains this declining enrollment? Law schools appear to be getting whiter as, first, affirmative action policies are rolled back, as in California or Texas, through state ballot initiatives and other legal attacks, and as law schools rely more heavily on LSAT than in admissions. As Professor Subotnik mentioned, touched on LSAT, I will do so as well. There's a strong correlation between rising minimum LSAT scores and decreasing African American admissions. Blacks, for example, as a group, consistently score about 9 points lower below the national average on the LSAT, and greater emphasis on this particular benchmark means that blacks receive a disproportionate share of rejection letters. A study of 8 states, including Ohio, found that schools that raised their LSAT minimums resulted in lower African American enrollment by about 19% on average, which means, of course, the vast majority of law schools. Between 2003 and 2008, 61% of African Americans were rejected by every law school to which they applied. The shutout rate for white applicants was 34%. These disparities are no less visible within the law school if we look at retention, graduation, and journal participation rates. In many respects, there is nothing unique or particular about the law school. It merely replicates disparities that exist in the pipeline. As you know, law schools require a college degree. In 2003, white college students accounted for 70% of college degrees. Black students earned 8.7% of college degrees that year, with comparable rates of 6.3 for Hispanics and 6.2 for Asians. Consider further the fact that you need a high school diploma or equivalent certification to attend most colleges. The educational experience of students of color and affluent white students in the United States, from pre-K on, is not just vastly different, we might say worlds apart. Because of the over-reliance on local property taxes to fund schools, a problem which the Ohio Supreme Court has on multiple occasions held unconstitutional, and the Milliken decision, which prohibits interdistrict busing, our K-12 school system incentivizes the clustering of families into neighborhoods with high property values and good schools on the one hand, and neighborhoods with low property values, endemic poverty, and failing schools on the other. Impoverished schools have higher needs per student, lower graduation rates, lower aspirations, and so on. In Ohio's 6 largest metropolitan areas, over half of all poor students are segregated into high poverty schools. The socioeconomic composition of the student body, not the student, is the leading indicator of its student achievement. It is students of color that experience the brunt of this concentration. Even though there are more poor whites in absolute numbers, 3/4 of persons living in concentrated poverty are black or Latino. Only 1/5 of the schools with less than 10% either black or Latino populations are high poverty schools. There is a profound relationship between poverty and racial segregation that particularly harms students of color. In 2000, the neighborhood poverty rate for the average African American household in Ohio's largest metropolitan areas was double to triple the neighborhood poverty rates to the average white neighborhood household. The experience of neighborhood poverty disproportionately and negatively affects students of color. A Harvard Sampson study shows that living in neighborhood poverty affects verbal ability scores to the equivalent of 4 IQ points per year. It is these facts which explain the standardized test achievement gap and other pipeline problems. But these facts pose a larger problem for the profession. While racial and ethnic minorities make up over 30% of the U.S. population, they account for less than about 15% of practicing attorneys. In this context, recall Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's admonition that universities, and in particular law schools, represent the training ground for a large number of the nation's leaders. Consequently, she says, law schools must remain visibly inclusive of individuals of every race and ethnicity. Otherwise, democratic leaders might, quote, lack legitimacy in the eyes of the citizenry, and the institutions of higher education that provide this training might lose public confidence in their, quote, openness and integrity. The history of the law school is frankly a story of exclusion. Few 19th century practitioners attended law school. In fact, by 1891, less than 1/5 of practicing attorneys had actually attended law school. Famous attorneys like Abraham Lincoln had no formal legal education. The ascendancy of the institution and the ABA-led accreditation movement at the turn of the century and in the 1920s and 30s drove many, if not most, minority-led law schools out of existence, preventing women, racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, working classes from the legal professions. The law school, including its over-reliance on LSAT, continues to serve exclusionary ends today.
I want to make something clear, and that is that I am not opposed to affirmative action. In fact, I favor affirmative action. The topic under discussion today is racism in our law schools. And my point is that we still don't know where the racism is in our law schools after hearing from Mr. Menendian. Where is it? Now let's talk a little bit about the LSAT. The LSAT is not a bad measure of academic ability, according to psychometricians. It predicts 46% of the first year GPA of students. Now you can say all you want that it's not the best measure, but in fact, no one has come up with a better measure. The LSAT has been critiqued for years and years, and nobody has suggested anything that might help to bring in more African American students, which in turn would be correlated with GPA. Now, if you want to say, and I'm okay with that, if you want to say GPA is not important, it's not a measure of likely success in the future, I'm all for it. Let's give up the GPA. Let's do it honestly. Let's say let's say it doesn't measure what the lawyer has to know and be done with it. No more grades, no more final exams, no more grading. I cheer it. And maybe you do as well. But we don't hear that. All we hear about is that it discriminates. But it doesn't discriminate. What it does is it measures a certain kind of academic ability that tracks to GPA. Now, why is it that we have these problems? And Steve Menendian is right to an extent. We have a dreadful way of teaching our minority students in this country. The gaps are enormous. The average 17-year-old white male, high school graduate, is matched by an African-American student who reads at 8th grade level. There's a grade gap, there's a 200-point LSAT gap. The gaps have not changed for the last 10 years. It's going on and on and on. And it happens, and this is the point I want to emphasize, not only at the schools that get inferior funding, it happens at the very best schools. If you want to get a sense of this, take a look at a book by John Oku, OGBU. It came out in 2003, called Black American Students in an Affluent Suburb. It's a story of the Shaker Heights school system, and I'm going to summarize it with one datum. White students in this middle to upper middle class school graduated, the white students graduated, 77% of white students graduated with honors, 2% of African American students graduated with honors. This is a catastrophe. The catastrophe is in our best schools as well as in our worst schools. And that suggests, and particularly after reading Opu, that there is a problem that is not in the air ducts of our high schools, and by extension, in the air ducts of our law schools. There's another problem, and that has to be dealt with. And what Opu says is very clearly, Opu is black, was black, he died a few years ago. Opu says that the black American students in Shaker Heights are not working hard enough. It's not racism, it's not that teachers don't care, it's not a culture of despair, they simply are not working hard enough. And I'll stop there and I'll finish up when I come back.
Before I address the blame the victim argument, I want to talk a little bit about the LSAT. I think Professor Subotnik actually misunderstands the argument. The argument isn't the LSAT is useless. I'm saying that it's being inappropriately overused and over-relied upon, and that as a criteria for admissions, it should be circumscribed. I'll talk a little bit why this is the case, but in a moment when I talk about the ADA. First of all, I want to contest his claim that it's a strong or useful predictor. There is a good deal of evidence, including Lonnie Guinier and Michelle Fine's study, as he is well aware, that the LSAT predicted only 14% of the variance of first-year grades at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and 15% in the second year. An LSAC, the Law School Admissions Council representative that spoke with Lonnie Guinier, actually claimed that the law school admissions test was only 9% better than random. Now, I know that there is a good deal of criticism on that, saying, well, you're looking at an elite law school and the variation between LSAT is probably much lower. But even if we credit the statistic that he cited, which is 46%, that's quite low. That really raises questions about the strength of the correlation. Lonnie Guinier actually asserts that the main thing the LSAT correlates with is grandparent wealth, which suggests the LSAT really measures intergenerational wealth and opportunity. A set of similar findings entail about the SAT. In fact, a USA Today study showed that in 2009, the highest average score on the SAT was posted by students who reported their income as families greater than $200,000. Secondly, there is a larger question about whether the LSAT actually helps predict not just success or GPA in law school, but in the profession. Is a good lawyer one that performs well on the LSAT? It doesn't account for a range of skills, such as people skills dealing with clients, juries, that the great lawyers need. It's about as bad as using a written exam to measure firefighter leadership in Richmond. In reviewing a comprehensive study of Michigan law school graduates, this study concluded there was no relationship between LSAT and undergraduate GPA scores and subsequent success in the legal profession, as measured either by income or career satisfaction. In fact, there was a negative correlation between LSAT scores and those who went on to serve in public service or become leaders. I contend, and many jurists and many educators agree, the purpose of the law school is not simply to prepare individuals for the profession or even generate academic knowledge, but to serve as an egalitarian force in public good and democracy. Because, as Justice O'Connor and others have pointed out, lawyers play a very critical role in securing justice for the public and serving as leaders. Most ABA schools appeared strictly concerned with numbers. No depth is given in their evaluations, and no consideration of those intangible factors that make the road harder for many students of color. If the LSAT was so great, why is the ABA criticizing over-reliance and even recommending its disuse? The special committee of the ABA last year blasted law schools for over-reliance on the LSAT, a consequence in the ABA's view of the impact of U.S. News and World Report rankings on law schools. The report says that the methodology discourages the award of financial aid based upon need because law schools are incentivized to enroll students with high LSAT scores. An ABA panel reviewing law school accreditation rules is actually leaning towards a recommendation that would end the requirement that law schools use the LSAT. Whether they would do so remains to be seen, but many undergraduate colleges that have made SAT or ACT optional in recent years have generally found that such shifts attract more applicants in a diverse applicant pool without leading to any loss in academic performance. While the thrust of my argument concerns the pipeline of the law school, there are other structural elements that contribute to racial outcomes, those that he's calling me to talk about. Another piece of those structural argument concerns the climate within law school. By almost all accounts, the law school experience is a singularly difficult one notoriously portrayed in films like The Paper Chase. Now imagine the experience for students of color. Imagine walking into a first-year torts room, a large lecture hall with 90 students, but imagine if everyone in the room was African American, and the professor was African American. Imagine if there were only 6 whites in the hall. That's the experience of minorities in most law schools. For students of color, it's a vastly different experience. This anxiety, generated not only by the first-year experience, but by the lack of diversity within the law school, can have academic consequences. Research into standardized testing by Professor Claude Steele, which I'm sure Dan Subotnik will criticize, reveals that this anxiety can generate what's called a stereotype threat that students of color experience when taking high-stakes tests. When there are negative stereotypes, and in fact any stereotype, about a particular group, individuals within that group can affect their test performance. So for example, in studies of Asian women, if you prime their Asianness on the stereotype that Asians do well in math exams and then administer such an exam, the cohort performs well. But if you prime their gender identity, the same cohort performs worse. In his writing, Professor Subotnik calls stereotype threat a poorly documented idea. Yet over 100 published studies have shown that when college students are placed in a situation that is explicitly evaluated and calls attention to a student's race or gender, stereotyped students experience extra anxiety, extra cognitive load, or surplus negative thoughts. The empirical research has found that African Americans to be particularly subject to stereotype threat in relation to standardized testing, a result of anxiety from perception that tests have been used to establish African American intellectual inferiority. Given the law school experience, it's not difficult to imagine how such threats could affect student performance. But they don't just operate within the law school, they may affect the ability of students to get into law school as well. I'll talk about other structural forces when I come back.
There are twice as many students who want to get into law school as there are places for in law school. And the question is, how are we going to make admissions decisions? We need some test. Now, maybe it's true, and in fact, I'll concede that it is true that social relations are important. There's this kind of social intelligence that explains a great deal of the success of people in the legal profession and all other professions. We don't have a test for that. One is coming, I can guarantee you, and how it's going to play out racially, I don't know. But right now, we don't have a test for that, so we have to use the only measure that we have. And 46% is generally recognized as a good correlation. Now, it's true. In 1997, a study by Lanny Guinier and Michelle Fine showed a much smaller correlation. And I don't know how to explain that, but I do know that the LSAC has, for the last 15 years, or 14 years, done studies almost annually, and the correlation has consistently stood at 46%, 45%, plus or minus 1. And so it would seem that that's a fairly good measure. In any event, again, we don't have anything else. As far as the ABA is concerned, it's true. The ABA wants to diminish use of the LSAT. Why that is, I don't know. There are people on the right who say that it's because the ABA and the ALS are dominated by the liberal wing of the academy. And I don't know, I can't give a better answer to that except to go back to the 2008 data that I cited, about 46%. As far as stereotype threat is concerned, we need to ask the question about what happens at other schools where African Americans make up a large majority of the students. Is there stereotype threat there? How do they do in relation to students at integrated schools? If in fact they do better than students at integrated schools, then maybe the answer is we got to go back, we got to scrap Brown versus Board of Education and go back to racially segregated institutions. I don't know what other conclusion to draw from that. That's a horrible conclusion, but it would seem to follow rationally from a conclusion that a stereotype threat is a serious problem in academia. Much has been written about stereotype threat. I commend an article by Amy Wax to you on the subject, WAX. She teaches at the University of Pennsylvania and wrote a piece about 2 years ago on that. Let me leave you with a couple of thoughts, and I think they're happy ones. In law school, we like to think that we have some kind of historical consciousness, but there are really many views of history. But let me just highlight two. You know, there's the Santayana view. There's the Faulkner view. The Faulkner view, in case you don't know it, is history is not even past. History is not dead, it's not even past. And then there's the Henry Ford view. History is bunk. We are locked into our history, is the first view. We are locked in and we can't get out. And the Henry Ford view is that we make our own history. And I want to suggest to you that we in legal academia are much too tied to the first view than to the second view. Things have changed. And if you want me to prove it to you with one datum, consider this. During the period of slavery, black women were were vulnerable to any white man who wanted to violate her. And if you look, can I have 1 minute? Or shall I come back afterwards?
Go ahead.
Okay. And if you want to say that slavery is still with us, consider this. To what extent are white men raping black women today? The answer is 0. I don't mean literally 0, I mean statistically 0. Now, how can you say, on the one hand, that we are still living a slave culture, and at the same time acknowledge the wonderful news that there is no statistical white-on-black rape today?
Respectfully, much of that was a non sequitur. The issue is whether the law school is an exclusionary institution, and I've identified many ways in which it produces disadvantage for students of color. The question is, is the law school a training ground for the elite, or is it a public good in service of democracy? 74% of students at the 146 most selected four-year colleges and universities in the U.S. come from the top quarter of American families, compared to only 3% who come from the bottom quarter. Rather than repeat a lot of the issues that I've already raised, the statistics regarding the LSAT, the exclusionary mechanisms, the question of climate, I want to talk a little bit about how we can address some of these issues, because I think that's really the most important issue here. In particular, I think that there are a number of possible interventions that can help alleviate particularly the anxiety experience generated perhaps by stereotype threat or the experience of the first year of law school, to increase the confidence of students of color and help improve outcomes, despite all of the many pipeline issues. For example, faculty hiring policies can have a tremendous effect. Research in the undergraduate and K-12 context demonstrates that staff diversity serves a number of potential positive ends. It can increase the number of role models for students of color, increase aspiration and self-expectations for those students, serve as cultural brokers, helping students navigate their school environment and culture, and provide opportunities for students to learn about racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. Andrea Dees, the Associate Dean at William Mitchell, says, quote, "All these professional type careers don't seem attainable to young blacks until they see someone like them who has succeeded. There is no reason to think that those things don't also remain true of law faculty. Diversity committees and minority student organizations can serve similar functions, organizing students into groups where they can organize around shared experiences, connecting them to professionals in the community who can serve both as mentor and role models, and so on. In addition, a diversity program can serve to raise awareness of these many issues and help generate a more welcoming climate for an overwhelmingly white institution."
With that, we will open up the floor to questions and answers from the audience. Questions from the audience? Well, I guess I could ask a question. Mr. Menendian, you mentioned that there was there's been a lot of differences between getting minority students into the pipeline, and yet at the same time you mentioned that Asian students accounted for about 7% of enrollment, if I remember correctly. I guess, how do you account for that? Is there an explanation you can offer?
So one of the statistics I point out is the relationship between concentrated poverty and segregation. But the experience, but as I also said, that 3/4 of persons living in concentrated poverty are black or Latino. I did not say Asian. So the relationship between concentrated poverty and Asian is not as profound as it is for blacks and Latinos.
I guess to follow up then, is there something else that accounts for that?
Right. So as I explained earlier, the experience of living in concentrated poverty has a series of profoundly negative influences. So I mentioned the Harvard-Sampson study, which showed that living in a high-poverty neighborhood, this was a longitudinal study conducted in Chicago over 2,000 students over 7 years. And what it found was that if you live in a concentrated neighborhood, a high-poverty neighborhood, it actually affects your verbal ability as measured by tests to the equivalent of 4 IQ points per year. So that's what accounts for that. And if the LSAT measures cognitive ability using standard English and so on and so forth, and vocabulary like the SAT, then it will manifest in those measurements.
Yes?
How are you going to change law school administrators' incentives? I mean, it seems like law school
Great question.
for these law school rankings. You know, Moritz wants to be in the top 20 or whatever, and the only way they can get there is by having the high LSAT scores, by having professors with, you know, credits after their name, 2 pages long. You know, and just due to the pipeline that you discussed, there's probably not a lot of African-American professors out there walking around with Harvard, Yale, PhDs and whatever. So how are you going to change the incentive system?
Well, that's the big issue, is why are universities so obsessed with U.S. News and Report rankings, and how can we stop that over-reliance? The ABA has made those moves. So I mentioned the ABA Special Committee. I mentioned the ABA's recommendation to disuse or reduce the reliance on LSAT in favor of other measures. Of course, the U.S. News and Report loves it because it's easy to gather data on LSAT and easier to rank schools on the basis of that. But we need to collectively find a way to reduce that relationship. And I think not just in the law school, but more generally, it's problematic.
But isn't it essentially a business? I mean, they want to have the highest ranking, so students want to go there.
Raise your hand if you think U.S. News and Reports is a good thing for universities and law schools.
It's a good thing for them because
Okay,
it
so 3
generates
people raise
business.
their hand. I think that answers the question. Thank you.
All right, next question? Yes.
Stephen, you talked a lot about diversity and importance of diversity for students of color, role modeling, for creating a climate. I wonder if you could talk about stereotype trend and implicit bias and its impact on white students that I didn't speak to, and sort of the social phenomenon that affects not just white students or Latino students, that actually affect our entire society.
It's a great question. You missed the second part of my segment in which I addressed that. So a large part of it has to do with the stereotypes that stereotype threat measures affect everyone for which those group is being stereotyped. And those anxieties affect everyone. And to the extent that we can reduce those anxieties or find interventions to alleviate them, it will actually create a better experience for all students. So, I mentioned the experience of being a 1L. To the extent that we create a better climate for everyone, those anxieties will be reduced for everyone, and performance should accordingly follow.
Well, one of the things I was hoping you talked a little bit about the bias. So, for example, if you say the faculty of color, it doesn't have to say positive effect on students of color, it has a positive effect on white students. I don't know if you talked about that earlier or not. Did you?
No.
All right, other questions? Yes.
It seemed like you were trying to draw a correlation between the kids at the top universities and their average household income. The rich have more money and their kids are at the better schools. But then it seems like you made a jump to having more money causes better LSAT scores. You said something
So
about...
there was a relationship between SAT and LSAT scores and grandparent wealth, which I pointed out. So the point is that intergenerational wealth has a very strong correlation. In fact, it might be the strongest correlation with standardized test scores. Does anyone have questions for Professor Subotnik?
Are you feeling sorry for me?
Well, there are a few, so we'll get started right here.
Yeah, I do. It seems to me that the bigger problem in the law school context than disparate LSAT scores by race ethnicity is the fact that it is this pipeline issue, right? It is the fact that a large proportion of African American and Latino students who could get to the age of 21 or 22 and aspire to law school or medical school or graduate school or whatever, in fact never get to that point of aspiring realistically to those sorts of pursuits. So let me take up specifically the context of class. Stephen's point about how 75% of kids at the most selective universities and colleges come from the wealthiest families, whether it was the top quarter, he said, as opposed to 3% that come from the bottom quarter. So can you speak to that? I mean, what is that about? Right? What is this sort of dramatic winnowing, and what can we do about it?
A lot has been written about cultural capital and how it passes from generation to generation, and in the absence of an authoritarian society where we tell parents you can't speak to your kids, you can't teach them so that's going to be very hard. Nevertheless, it has been done. I mean, there are periods in American history where we have all kinds of immigrant experience that suggests that it can be done. People come with no education, and a generation later they're producing the psychiatrists and the doctors and the physicists. So it can be done. Again, we're not imprisoned kind of within the structure of the cultural capital that we have. Now, how we get there in the African American community, I can't say exactly. My focus today is to answer the question, is there racism in the law school? I think that's highly destructive, and which is why I go around the country talking about that. If we can't find racism in the law school, let's not claim it. And one of the wonderful benefits that will happen, that we'll see if we can get away with claiming racism in the law schools, is that we can bring the community together to solve the problem. If you have the white community being charged with racism and sexism, I might add, because I write about that also at every turn, the community can't get together. I can't work with you if you're charging me on a daily basis with racism. If on the other hand you say we have a problem, can you, a serious problem, can you help me? Under those circumstances, there's at least there's a strong possibility. And if you really want me to analyze why it is that we have a virulent right-wing talk show community, it's because of that.
Can I just ask a
Yeah, sure.
So first, I mean, can we distinguish between, we can talk about what we mean by racism, but can we also distinguish between race or an analytical framework that is a framework that looks closely at race, right, as a matter of analysis?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and race, yes.
And then the communications piece you're talking about. So, sort of talking, accusing someone of being a racist, yeah, that's probably not a great way to get the conversation going, but that is a distinct thing from the analytical.
Oh, I'm all for it. Well, this is how I make my living. By talking about race and gender.
Let me just a matter of clarity. So are you saying, for example, that the 25-to-1 ratio of most affluent quartile to least affluent quartile in our most selected colleges and universities, so that is due to differences in cultural capital? That's just for clarity, that's what you're saying.
I think that's a lot of it, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Mr. Goldberger.
Just been thinking about Professor Subotnik's premises, and it seems to me both speakers agree that, if I'm hearing it right, maybe they don't exactly agree when I put it in my language rather than theirs, that a cultural matrix has affected academic performance.
My argument is not a cultural one, it's a structural one. So for example, I said that the system, basically the over-reliance on local property taxes, the DeRolf decisions, interacting with the Millikan decision has created basically two worlds, two school systems.
But that's not a causal relationship, it's
Sure it is.
correlation.
It is a causal relationship.
Correlation is not causality.
I understand. But what I'm saying is that our legal structures, the rules that govern the system of educational provision in the United States, have essentially generated or produced, on the one hand, high poverty, endemic poverty, low performing schools, and on the other hand, affluent districts with high property values.
So you don't think there's any cultural impact on the performance of students, so that when I know a high school student who performs well, who's called an Oreo by his classmates, that's not culture.
If someone is being called an Oreo by his students, that would seem like a racial epithet.
Yeah, but his fellow black students are calling him an Oreo because he's performing.
Well, what does that have to do with this
What
issue?
I'm saying is that is a disincentive for him to perform. And when you have that kind of a matrix in the school, that comes from the cultural matrix in the community that, for one reason or another, performance is.
So do we think that the student performance is more affected by the fact of poverty and low-performing schools, or do we think it's more affected by students who are called Oreos?
Well, my point is that they run together, and they're related to one another.
I would be very cautious about oversubscribing to these cultural explanations.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Mr. Subotnik,
Yes.
you asked for example of racism in law school and positive that you hadn't had anything to go. Let me give you this one and see what you think of it. During my 1L year, I repeatedly heard the following comment. Affirmative action and admissions policies harm this school's standing in the U.S. News and World Report rankings based on the assumption, I believe a racist assumption, that minority students have poor LSAT scores and poor GPAs and drive down our ranking. Do you want to discuss whether you think that's racist?
By itself, no. Let me tell you why. There is something to the argument, right? Unfortunately, and some of you here in the room have pointed it out, we are governed by the U.S. News and World Report, and I admit, along with Steve, that it's unfortunate to the extent that you raise your entering credentials, you improve the standing of the school. That's the reality of it. So, do I think that's racist? No, it's a statement. It's a statement about ranking, and not necessarily anything more than about ranking.
White students who make that comment don't know the LSAT scores of the minority students at the school. So how is it not an assumption?
And I guess the answer to that is the data that Steve himself cited, and that is, and it's grotesque, there's a huge difference in LSAT scores on average between African American students and white students. This is a central problem in our society. You can't hide from it, and not only can't you hide from it, you shouldn't hide from it. That's the problem that needs to be addressed. Rather than saying, well, LSAT doesn't mean anything, it doesn't measure anything, which is the prevailing countercultural theory, we say it does mean something, and let's solve it. I'm not saying that's easy.
Other questions? Yes.
Earlier you mentioned a study, the Shaker Heights suburb, and you talked about how, despite the fact that minorities were in a rich school, they were still failing. I mean, do you really believe that? There's a lot of other studies that show the contrary, that if you put minority students in a situation where there's more competition, where there's more higher achievers, they in fact do well. I mean, I've never heard of that study. I've been out of the game for a while, but I don't think that's dispositive, right?
Nothing is dispositive. But that's as good a piece of data as I can find, and I look hard for data. This was done by a black professor, so I'm particularly tied to this particular study. But there's nothing like this, and there is a, if you want another vision, there's a PBS program called School Colors that I saw about 10 years ago as I was writing my book, and it's a study of the Berkeley High comes to the same conclusions, exactly the same conclusions, it's older. Same conclusions. On the one hand, you have the sons and daughters of the Berkeley faculty, and on the other hand, you have the sons and daughters of the folks in the lowlands who live down by the bay. All the stars, almost all the stars, are the children of the Berkeley professors, and all those at the bottom of the heap are kind of the working folks at the bottom of the hill. I don't know of any other studies. I look, and I continue to look.
I think the explanation for the Shaker Heights study is that the Shaker Heights, I'm not 100% certain of this, was a highly segregated school system. That is, it was affluent, but it was segregated. There are two conditions that have to be met to really reduce the achievement gap. One is integration, and the second is the low poverty. The studies consistently show, and there's just a wealth of research on this, that if you attend an integrated K-12 school, it increases the likelihood of college attendance, the likelihood of graduating from college, and it improves student performance and aspirations among tests on math, science, language, social studies. They take higher level math and science courses in and so on and so forth. So it's not just poverty or affluence, it's segregation as well.
Yes.
I'm interested in this culture versus structure thing. So, and I know that you said that you were mostly just about, this question about racism within the law school. But I'm going to pull back a little bit and go to that K-12 level again. And it seems to me that so anecdotes about black kids being called Oreo notwithstanding, and I think the question about cultural differences and how cultural differences by race or class and account for these differences in educational outcomes is questionable in my view. But let's say for the sake of argument that culture may have something to do with it. I think the structural differences that Steve was pointing to are pretty easily documented and have been documented well. So not just when we talk about differences in teacher quality and differences in resources and differences in infrastructure. We're literally talking about, anyway, here's my question. As a matter of public policy, doesn't it seem that the structural disparities, which are really pretty evident and unmistakable, are more amenable to policy intervention as opposed to the cultural stuff? I mean, shouldn't that be what we're aiming to as a matter of what our government should be doing?
I agree there, but let me flesh out my answer. I just picked this book up in your bookstore here. This is the new, fairly new, William Julius Wilson book, More Than Just Race. And he says, quite explicitly at the very beginning, that it's a problem of both culture and structure. And we should admit the cultural problem. It is not bad faith to talk about the cultural problem. Other people have said the same, many other people. Orlando Patterson, prominent sociologist at Harvard, said exactly the same thing. And I just want to put that on the table. Sure, in terms of public policy, the structural problem is what should be focused on. But somebody has to deal with the cultural problem. And I don't know who that is. I can't do it. I mean, I can't do it. Barack Obama can't do it.
But don't you think we've been saying, I mean, it's funny to say, let's put the cultural problem on the table as if it's ever been off the table.
Well, I'll tell you how it's been off the table, and I remember this very well. I remember Bill Cosby being on stage and talking about how the working class black kids weren't being taught how to speak proper English. And much of the academic community came down like a ton of bricks on him for that. Eric Dyson wrote a book on Bill Cosby, bashing him for raising the cultural problem. 3 years later, 4 years later, where we are, I think we're coming to the position where we understand that there is a cultural problem that has to be dealt with. I think there's been great improvement, but it ain't easy for members of the black community to speak about this. I never hear the NAACP talking about this. I never hear Jesse Jackson talking about this. I never hear the Black Academy talking about this problem.
Yes, did you have a response? Yes.
Just a couple points. I grew up in Shaker Heights for many years, but I think it's fair to say that once, and I think it's more balanced now racially than when I was there. It was probably about a third minority at the high school level. But it is true that at the elementary levels, there were integrated elementary schools and there were more segregated. Not that that's still true, but certainly, the earlier education experiences might have been different. And it seemed, to me, it was more of a class than a race issue. Although there's some correlation there, certainly. The other thing is that I'm going to be speaking here on Wednesday to the Education Law Group. I'm a civil rights litigator for people with disabilities, and there is certainly some overlap with disabilities, race, and education. And some of the statistics I have looked at most recently from the U.S. Department of Education, just putting some of that together, and again, going not to causation, just what the numbers are, what they are, and I think these are complex problems. I'm not going to call people racist, but the numbers are concerning because African American children are labeled as having mental retardation much more than they are of learning disabilities. And even when they are labeled with the same disability categories as white children, they're segregated much more. So there's something that's cause for concern, and that relates to not just segregation, but also accountability measures, graduation, dropout. And I don't think there's a single simple cause. And I do appreciate you taking on these complex and sensitive issues. I think the important thing is to have the dialogue and to not look simplistically at these things, and to try and create a society that welcomes diversity, not to discredit merit, but also that there is value in diversity. Coming from Shaker Heights and then going to Kenyon College and going to law school, I really miss that diversity. I miss it in the field. I think and as a public employee, we have an obligation to have culturally sensitive services that serves all people, and I think that's really hard for public agencies to do. So I don't have any answers. It's not really a question. It's just a comment applauding you for this effort, and that we should be working together to make this a better situation for everyone. Thank you.
I've been paid to come here and make trouble. How can I make trouble into that?
Other questions? Yes.
I have a comment. Hopefully it's some good news. I'm not sure if everyone in the room is aware, but Moritz is part of a statewide pipeline diversity program. And we work in the summers during the school year with students from predominantly Columbus Public Schools. And if anyone wants to get involved, we pay the teachers over the summer, and there's opportunities to tutor. So if you believe there's a pipeline problem and you want to make a difference, come see me or Kathy Miller.
Let me say something to this lady here who's teaching in the civil rights area. I just read a book that you might be interested in. It has to do with public education, and it catalogs the utter failure of America to deal with the educational problem that we have, class-based and race-based. And my guess is that this book, although it hasn't been reviewed yet, is going to have traction and get a lot of attention. And I noted when I finished this just a couple of days ago that it tracks a book written by Charles Murray a couple of months ago. The name of the book is Bad Students, Not Bad Schools, and the author is Murray Weisberger, who is chair of the political science department at the University of Illinois. It is a terrifying book, and it catalogs all the efforts that we've made over the years to narrow the racial gap in education and the utter failure of those efforts.
Well, just in the interest of full disclosure,
Yeah.
I am a trial attorney on Doe versus State of Ohio, which is a school funding case. Since Doral ended, we had intervened in federal action representing class of students with disabilities. Judge Bolshu, who just recently passed away, had that case and also transferred, but we've been pending since 1993. So I am interested in the effects of property taxes and wealth and achievement, and particularly as it relates to the federal mandates for students with disabilities and the services and opportunities that they have. So I just, in the interest of full disclosure, I do think that it is a factor. It is not the only factor, but it is a factor.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, I assumed there was something. Well, I do have one other question. I know we're running low on time, but it's targeted for Professor Subotnik. Subotnik, you mentioned the Shaker Heights study by Professor Oku. I got the name right. I sort of was exposed to that as a third-hand fashion through Tom Woods, but I remember reading from that second-hand summary that Professor Oku had sort of a different take on why black students that he observed were performing worse due to sort of cultural differences, and he contrasted his experience growing up in Africa. I guess he's a naturalized U.S. citizen. I guess if you could summarize or comment on those cultural differences he mentioned between, his upbringing, sort of more, maybe traditional African society as opposed to the African American society, what that is all about.
I never read any biographical sketch on Oku. I know that Oku made a name for himself talking about the problem of acting white. He and I think Signithia Fordham wrote a couple of articles that got a lot of attention in the early 90s, does it say anything about class? So maybe, and he died a few years later. Maybe he was, kind of not at full strength when he was doing this book. But there was no sense in which he thought that there was any racism in the law school. He didn't point to any differences in teachers, any problems with administration, nothing along those lines.
Can I take a closing?
Yes.
Let me take a closing shot at Professor Subotnik. And that is,
You should all know that Professor Goldberger is a cousin, so you should interpret his question in that light.
cousin by marriage.
All the more reason for interpretation.
It seems to me, what I was trying to drive at before, because I vehemently disagree with Mr. Menendian on the role of culture in the process. And one is always nervous about talking about culture because I have one, and you didn't do it, but you're accused of racism by bringing up the cultural dimension. But it seems to me, looking at it the way that, any way that you want to, whether it's cultural or whether there's a disparity problem in the K through 12 experience generated by racism, because I believe that some of the cultural milieu is generated by racism. And this is to Professor Subotnik, my cousin, can't you say that to the extent that the academy, talking about now university and graduate school education, doesn't do anything about it, but simply goes along and basically takes the students as it finds them, some of whom have been harmed by the cultural milieu that I'm concerned about, and just ignores it. Isn't that a form? Aren't they responsible? We're not going to call it intentional racism in the classic sense, but aren't we as educators responsible for perpetuating the consequences or the impact of segregation or racism or whatever you want to call it?
I agree. It's a great point.
Let me just say something, since this keeps coming up again and again.
And this is my former student too. So
I've emphasized the structural factors, the disparities between education, the property taxes, and so on and so forth. Let's assume that there is a cultural element. I would argue that the cultural element is actually generated by structure. That is, the disparities in funding and neighborhood poverty actually generate whatever cultural differences and cultural negative effects exist. So, to that extent, it's actually all structure. The structural argument drives and generates those cultural forces to the extent they exist.
All right, with that, we're just going to sum it up, I guess. I know we're running short on time. Please join me in a final round of applause for both our speakers today.